The carriage wheel struck a stone in the road, and the whole frame shook so hard that Eliza Colborne nearly bit through her own tongue. Outside the window, rain fell in gray sheets over the hills of Yorkshire, and somewhere behind her, back in the city she had left forever that morning, 3 men were laughing about the trap they had just set for her. She did not know their names yet. She would learn them soon enough. What she knew, sitting stiff and alone in that shaking carriage, was that she had been sold. Not with coins passed across a table, but with a signature on a marriage contract that her own father had been pressured into signing. A merchant's daughter, plain in the eyes of the nobility, was being sent to marry a lord nobody wanted to marry, on an estate that everybody said was already dying. Lord Edward Ashworth had not chosen her. She had not chosen him. Both of them, in different ways, were being used as weapons in a war they had not started. The carriage slowed as it climbed a long hill, and through the streaked window Eliza caught her first sight of Ashworth Hall. It rose out of the mist like something built by giants who had long since abandoned it. Gray stone towers stood against a darker gray sky. Ivy had crawled up one entire wing of the house and appeared to be winning some silent war against the windows. A single light burned in an upstairs room. Everything else was dark. She pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass and reminded herself of the plan the 3 men had described to her father in that overheated drawing room 3 weeks earlier, believing she could not hear them through the door. Lord Pemberton, thin and precise as a blade, had said it plainly: send the merchant's daughter to the Ashworth estate. Let her dull manners and common blood embarrass the family beyond recovery. Nothing destroys an old name faster than a bride nobody respects. Lady Vane had laughed at that, a small, cold sound. And Edward Ashworth himself, they had agreed, would be too broken by his own troubles to notice what was happening to him until it was far too late. Eliza had said nothing to her father about what she'd overheard. There had been no use in it. The contract was already prepared. Refusing would have ruined her family's business and her father's health along with it. So she had done the only thing left to a person with no power and every reason to be afraid. She had decided to survive it, and more than survive it. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of the great doors, and a servant appeared with an umbrella that did almost nothing against the driving rain. Eliza stepped down onto gravel that had not been raked in what looked like years, weeds pushing up between the stones, and looked up at the house that was now supposed to be her home. Nobody came out to greet her. She waited a full minute in the rain before the doors finally opened, and a tall, thin woman in an old-fashioned black dress looked her over from head to foot with an expression that could have curdled milk. "You must be the bride," the woman said, in a voice that made the word sound like an insult. "I am Mrs. Prout, the housekeeper. His lordship is not able to receive you at present." "Not able," Eliza repeated, rainwater running down the back of her neck, "or not willing." Mrs. Prout's mouth tightened into a thin line. "That is not for me to say, madam." She led Eliza inside without offering to help with the trunk still sitting in the rain. And Eliza understood, within the first 30 seconds of walking through that entrance hall, exactly how this was going to go. The staff had already decided who she was before she'd said a single word. A trade of goods for a title, that was all this marriage was to them. A humiliation dressed up in silk. The entrance hall itself told its own story before Mrs. Prout said another word. Dust lay thick along the tops of picture frames. A chandelier hung dark and unlit even though the afternoon light barely reached the corners of the room. 2 long cracks ran across the ceiling like old scars. Somewhere far off, Eliza heard the drip of water falling steadily onto a wooden floor, a sound nobody in the house seemed to be bothering to fix. She was shown to a room on the 2nd floor, small and cold, with a fireplace that had clearly not held a fire in some time. There was no welcome basket, no note, no sign that anyone in this house had prepared for her arrival beyond the bare requirement of putting a bed in a room. "Dinner is at 7, Mrs. Prout said from the doorway. "His lordship does not always attend." Then she left, and Eliza was alone. For a long moment, standing in that cold little room with rain still dripping from her hair onto the floorboards, Eliza allowed herself exactly one breath of despair. Just one. She thought of her father's tired face, of the years he had spent building his trading company from nothing, of the ledgers she used to help him balance late at night when she was a girl of 12, sitting on a high stool with ink on her fingers while he taught her how numbers never lied even when people did. Then she straightened her spine, wrung the rain from the ends of her hair, and began to unpack her own trunk since nobody else seemed inclined to help her. At 6 that evening, a young maid named Alice knocked timidly on her door to tell her that dinner would be served shortly, and to ask, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether the new lady of the house required anything. It was the first kind word Eliza had heard since stepping out of the carriage, and she made certain to thank the girl properly, looking her in the eye the way her father had always looked at every clerk and dockworker in his employment, as though their name and their opinion actually mattered. Alice seemed startled by this. It appeared no one had looked at her that way in quite some time either. Dinner was eaten in a dining room built for 40 guests, and occupied that evening by exactly one. Eliza sat at the long table beneath portraits of Ashworth ancestors, who all seemed to be staring down at her with the same disapproving expression as Mrs. Prout, and ate a thin soup that had clearly been stretched to make it last, while a single footman stood by the door pretending not to watch her. Lord Edward Ashworth did not appear. She asked carefully whether his lordship was unwell. "His lordship keeps to his study most evenings," the footman answered, in a tone that suggested this was a fact everyone in the house had long ago learned not to question. After dinner, Eliza did not return directly to her cold little room. Instead, she walked the halls of the house slowly, a single candle in her hand, looking at everything the way her father had taught her to look at a ship before deciding whether to invest in it. Not at what it was pretending to be, but at what it actually was. What she saw troubled her more with every step: a library with empty shelves where books had clearly been sold, a drawing room with pale squares on the wallpaper where paintings had once hung and had since been removed, likely also sold, furniture that was fine and old but showing signs of long neglect, legs unsteady, upholstery worn through at the arms. This was not merely a house that had fallen out of fashion. This was a house being slowly bled dry. She found the study by following a thin line of candlelight beneath a closed door at the end of the west corridor. She stood outside it for a long moment, listening. There was no sound from within except, occasionally, the soft scratch of a pen and a long, tired exhale. She knocked. There was a pause before a voice answered, low and rough, as though it had not been used in speech for some hours. "Come in if you must." Eliza opened the door. The room was small compared to the rest of the house, but warmer than anywhere else she had been, a fire burning low in the grate. Papers covered nearly every surface, some of them yellowed with age, others fresh and covered in figures that even from the doorway Eliza could see did not add up to anything good. And behind the desk sat a man she recognized, from the one small portrait she had been shown before the wedding, as Lord Edward Ashworth. He looked older than the portrait, not in years, but in the way exhaustion ages a person faster than time ever could. His dark hair was unkempt, his collar loosened, and there were shadows beneath his eyes deep enough to look almost bruised. He did not stand when she entered, which she noted, and he did not smile, which she also noted, though somehow it did not sting the way Mrs. Prout's coldness had. "My lord," she said, and dipped a small, proper curtsy, because whatever this marriage was, whatever trap it had been built to be, she intended to conduct herself with more grace than anyone in this house currently expected of her. Edward looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "So they sent you," he said finally. "It was not a question. I confess I did not expect you to actually arrive in the rain. I assumed you would wait for better weather, being a merchant's daughter and unused to hardship." There was no cruelty in his voice, only a flat sort of weariness, as though he was simply repeating an assumption he had been given rather than one he had formed himself. But it stung all the same, and Eliza felt something in her spine straighten a little further. "I have crossed the channel twice in worse weather than this, my lord, on my father's ships. Checking cargo manifests myself so that no clerk could cheat him," she said. "A little Yorkshire rain did not trouble me nearly so much as the welcome I received upon arrival." That finally seemed to catch his attention. He set down his pen. "You checked cargo manifest yourself." "I did, and balanced his accounts from the age of 12, and negotiated with wool merchants from the age of 16, when my father's health first began to fail, and someone needed to speak plainly with men who assumed a young woman could be easily fooled." She let that sit in the air a moment. "I am not, my lord, whatever you have been told I am." Something flickered across his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Not quite hope. Something closer to curiosity, the first faint stirring of a man waking from a long sleep. But then his expression closed again, like a door shutting, and he looked back down at the papers on his desk. "It hardly matters what you are, madam," he said quietly. "This house is finished regardless. I would not waste your talents on it, whatever they may be. Better you keep to your rooms and let the whole sorry business run its course quietly." "Run its course to what end, my lord?" He did not answer. He simply picked up his pen again, a clear signal that the conversation, brief as it had been, was over. Eliza stood in the doorway a moment longer, studying him the way she had studied the house. Beneath the exhaustion and the resignation, she saw something else. Not a cruel man, not even a foolish one. A man who had been fighting alone for so long that he had convinced himself the fight was already lost, and had stopped believing that any help offered to him could possibly be real. She thought of the men in that overheated drawing room, so certain that a merchant's daughter would humiliate this family into ruin. She thought of the empty shelves and the sold paintings and the thin soup and the housekeeper's curled lip. They had sent her here to be a weapon against this house. Very well, she thought, closing the study door softly behind her and walking back through the dark, cold corridors toward her equally cold room. If a weapon was what they wanted, a weapon was what they would get. Just not the one they had planned for. That first night, Eliza lay awake for a long time listening to the rain against the window and the strange settling sounds of an old house around her, and she made herself a quiet promise. She would learn every debt this estate owed before the month was out. She would learn every name among the tenants and the staff. She would find out exactly who had been stealing from this family, because a house did not fall into such disrepair through bad luck alone, not when the land around it still looked capable of producing good crops, not when the family name still commanded the kind of respect that could open doors if used correctly. Somebody was profiting from Ashworth Hall's decline. She intended to find out who. She fell asleep, finally, somewhere near dawn, with the sound of dripping water still echoing faintly down the hall, and dreamed not of the wedding she had not wanted, nor of the cold reception she had received, but of her father's ledgers, columns of numbers marching in neat straight lines, waiting patiently for someone with the patience and the courage to sort out the truth from the lies. She woke the next morning before the rest of the house had stirred, dressed herself without waiting for a maid, and began. The first thing Eliza did before breakfast, before even splashing cold water on her face to wake herself fully, was find a piece of paper and begin a list. Not a list of complaints, though she certainly had enough material for one. A list of questions. Who managed the estate's finances? How many tenant farms remained occupied? What crops were being grown, and what the yields had been for the last several years? Where the family's remaining income, if any, was coming from? Who had access to the household accounts, and who had approved the sale of the paintings and books she had noticed the night before? She had learned this method from her father, who always said that a business could not be saved by anyone who did not first understand precisely how it was dying. Grief and blame solved nothing. Numbers, patiently gathered and honestly examined, solved almost everything. Breakfast, when it finally arrived in the small parlor where she'd been told to expect it, consisted of weak tea and bread with no butter. Mrs. Prout delivered this meager offering herself, apparently to enjoy watching Eliza's reaction to it, but Eliza only thanked her pleasantly and asked, in the same breath, for the name of the estate's steward. Mrs. Prout's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Godfrey Marsh has managed the estate's accounts for 11 years, madam. I doubt he would welcome interference." "I have no intention of interfering," Eliza said calmly, buttering nothing onto her bread since there was none to be had. "I intend to introduce myself as the new lady of this house, and to ask him some questions about how it is run. I imagine after 11 years he knows more about Ashworth Hall than anyone else alive. I should like to benefit from his experience." It was not quite true, this careful, pleasant framing, but it was close enough to true that Mrs. Prout could find no polite way to object to it. She left the room with her mouth pressed into its familiar thin line, and Eliza finished her plain bread with a small, private smile. She found Godfrey Marsh an hour later in a cramped office near the kitchens, a heavy-set man with small, quick eyes and an unusually fine gold watch chain for a man in his position. He rose when she entered, made a show of great respect, and offered her a chair with all the warmth of a man who had rehearsed exactly this kind of performance many times before. "My lady," he said smoothly, "what an honor. How may I be of service?" "You may show me the estate's accounts, Mr. Marsh," Eliza said, settling into the offered chair and folding her gloved hands neatly in her lap. "All of them, going back 5 years, if you would be so kind." The smile on Marsh's face did not disappear, but something behind his eyes went very still, like a pond freezing over. "5 years, my lady? That is a great deal of paper for a lady's first morning in her new home. Perhaps something lighter might suit better. A summary, say, that I could prepare for you at my leisure." "I have a great deal of patience for paper, Mr. Marsh, and very little for summaries prepared at someone else's leisure," Eliza said, with a smile every bit as pleasant as his own. "I was raised in trade. Numbers do not frighten me. I should like to see the ledgers themselves." There was a pause, brief but telling, before Marsh's smile widened just slightly too far. "Of course, my lady. I shall have them brought to your rooms directly." He did send them, eventually, though it took the better part of the day and several polite but firm reminders delivered through poor Alice, who clearly did not enjoy being caught between an impatient new mistress and a steward who did not like being questioned. When the ledgers finally arrived, stacked in 3 heavy leather-bound volumes, Eliza cleared the small writing desk in her room, lit every candle she could find, and began to read. She read through the afternoon and into the evening, skipping the dinner she had been told would be served at 7, sending Alice down instead with an apology and a request for tea and whatever bread could be spared. Page by page, column by column, she traced the estate's income and expenses back through the years, and slowly, the picture that emerged made her blood run cold with a very different kind of fury than she had felt in that overheated drawing-room weeks before. The farms were producing. That was the first thing she noticed, and the thing that troubled her most, because it meant the land itself was not the problem. Wheat yields, wool sales, even a modest income from a small quarry on the estate's northern edge, all of it recorded faithfully enough on paper. And yet year after year, the sums that reached the family's own accounts grew smaller and smaller, while entries for repairs, wages, and unspecified expenses grew larger and larger, in amounts that never quite matched anything Eliza could see evidence of around the house. No repairs had been made to the leaking roof she had heard dripping her very first night. No new wages appeared to have improved the condition of the staff, most of whom, she had already noticed, seemed thin, tired, and underpaid. Someone was skimming money from every part of this estate's income, disguising the theft behind vague expense categories that no one, apparently, had ever thought to question. She thought of Godfrey Marsh's fine gold watch chain, and of his eyes going still and cold at her request to see the books, and she felt a grim, quiet certainty settle over her like a second skin. But knowing was not enough. Her father had taught her that too. A suspicion, however strong, was worth nothing without proof solid enough to withstand questioning, and worth even less if acted upon carelessly, alerting the guilty party before the evidence could be secured. So instead of confronting Marsh the next morning, as every angry instinct in her urged her to do, Eliza did something far more patient. She began cross-checking. She sent quiet, carefully worded notes to several of the estate's tenant farmers, requesting simply to meet them and learn about their farms, as any conscientious new lady of the house might reasonably wish to do. She asked Alice, gently and without any hint of suspicion in her tone, about the household's wage payments, and about which tradesmen were used for repairs, and how often those tradesmen actually came. She examined the receipts Marsh had filed alongside his ledgers, and found that several were written in the same handwriting, supposedly from different merchants entirely, a detail so small that anyone reading quickly might easily have missed it. Each day for nearly 2 weeks, she built her case, quietly and carefully, the way her father had once shown her how to identify a corrupt clerk among his own dockworkers years before, by never showing her hand until she was entirely certain of the outcome. During this time she saw little of Edward Ashworth. He remained largely in his study, and on the rare occasions their paths crossed in a hallway or at a meal he did attend, he was polite but distant, a man still convinced, it seemed, that nothing good could come from paying too much attention to anything, including his own new wife. Eliza did not press him. She recognized in him something she had seen before in men who had lost too much, too many times to trust in hope again. Pressing him would only make him retreat further. Better, she decided, to simply show him, when the time came, rather than try to explain it beforehand. She did notice, however, small things. The way he sometimes looked at her a fraction longer than strictly necessary before catching himself and looking away. The way once she found a small vase of fresh flowers placed in her cold little room without explanation, and later learned, quite by accident, that Edward himself had asked the gardener to cut them from the one remaining healthy rose bush on the grounds. Small things. Cracks of light beneath a door that had been shut for a very long time. It was during her 10th day at Ashworth Hall that Eliza finally found the proof she needed. Among the ledgers, tucked between 2 ordinary-looking pages recording wool sales, she found a single loose sheet that had clearly been placed there by mistake, a private note in Marsh's own hand, addressed to no one, listing sums in a private code that took her the better part of an evening to decipher. But decipher it she did, using the same method her father had taught her for reading a competitor's disguised shipping manifests, and when she finally understood what the numbers meant, she sat back in her chair with her heart pounding. Marsh had been selling estate goods, wool and grain both, to buyers off the official books, then recording only a fraction of the true sale price in the ledgers, and pocketing the difference. Worse, several of the so-called repair expenses she had questioned were payments to men who did not exist at all, names invented purely to justify money flowing directly into Marsh's own accounts. Over the past 5 years, by Eliza's careful calculation, the man had stolen a sum large enough to have repaired every roof, paid every wage fairly, and left the estate with a healthy reserve besides. She did not sleep at all that night. She sat with the candle burning low and read the figures over and over, checking her own arithmetic 3 times the way her father always insisted, because an accusation of this magnitude could not be allowed even the smallest error. By morning she was certain, and she knew with the same quiet certainty exactly what she needed to do next. She did not go to Marsh directly. She went instead to the one man in the house whose word would actually carry weight against him. She found Edward in his study, as always, hunched over papers that she suspected by now were simply the same figures he had been staring at hopelessly for months, unable to see any way through them. He looked up when she entered, an expression of mild surprise crossing his tired face, since she had not sought him out uninvited before. "My lord," she said, setting the stack of ledgers and the single decoded sheet of paper carefully on his desk. "I believe I have found why this estate has been dying, and I do not believe it has anything to do with bad luck, or poor land, or any failing of your own." Edward looked down at the papers, then back up at her, something guarded and wary flickering across his features. "What is this?" "Proof, my lord," Eliza said steadily, "that your steward, Mr. Godfrey Marsh, has been stealing from this estate for at least 5 years and very likely longer. I have checked every figure 3 times. I would not bring this to you if I were not certain." For a long moment, Edward said nothing at all. He simply stared down at the papers spread before him, and Eliza watched something shift behind his eyes, a slow, dawning understanding, followed almost immediately by something that looked very much like anger finally waking up after a long, exhausted sleep. "5 years," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I trusted him with everything, My father trusted him before me. Then he betrayed 2 generations of trust instead of one, Eliza said. But my lord, the theft is not the only thing I have found. The land itself is good. The tenants are willing to work harder if given fair support. This estate is not dying of some incurable illness. It has been poisoned slowly by one man's greed. And poison, unlike illness, can be cut out. Edward looked up at her then, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time since her arrival, and Eliza saw in his eyes something she had not seen there before. Not merely surprise. Something closer to the first fragile stirring of hope, the kind a drowning man feels upon finally glimpsing land. "You did all of this," he said slowly, "in 10 days. I had excellent teachers, my lord, and a great deal of motivation." She allowed herself, finally, a small, tired smile. "I did not come to this house to watch it fall further into ruin while I sat quietly in a cold room being ignored. Whatever the reasons behind this marriage, my lord, I intend to make something of it, and something of this estate, whether anyone expected that of me or not." Edward was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not entirely read. Then slowly he stood, walked around the desk, and for the first time since her arrival, looked at her not as an unwanted burden forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control, but as something else entirely. A partner, perhaps, or at the very least the first real possibility of one. "Then we had better speak with Mr. Marsh," he said, "before he realizes what has been found." Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and thin, pale sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds over Ashworth Hall for the first time since Eliza's arrival, though neither of them noticed it just then, both too focused on the reckoning that was, at last, about to begin. They confronted Godfrey Marsh together that same afternoon, in his cramped little office near the kitchens, and Eliza watched with quiet satisfaction as the steward's practiced smile faltered, then cracked entirely, the moment Edward laid the decoded ledger sheet on the desk between them and asked him, in a voice gone cold and hard with 5 years of buried anger finally finding its target, to explain himself. Marsh tried at first to deny everything, then to explain it away as a misunderstanding. Then, when neither of those approaches found any purchase against the careful pile of evidence Eliza had assembled, to beg. He spoke of debts of his own, of a sick wife, of promises he had meant to make good on eventually. Eliza felt, despite everything, a small flicker of something like pity, quickly extinguished by the memory of the tenant farmers she had spoken with, thin and worried about the coming winter, and of the staff who had gone without proper wages while this man wore a gold watch chain that could easily have paid for a season's worth of roof repairs. Edward dismissed him that same day, informing him plainly that no charges would be brought only on the condition that every remaining shilling of the stolen money be returned immediately. A condition Marsh, faced with the alternative, agreed to with visible relief. It was not, Eliza knew, a complete solution. Years of damage could not be undone in a single afternoon, and the money Marsh returned, while substantial, would not by itself restore Ashworth Hall to what it had once been. But it was a beginning. The poison, as she had told Edward, had finally been cut out. That evening, for the first time since her arrival, Edward joined her for dinner in the great dining room, and though neither of them spoke much, there was a different quality to the silence between them now, something less like 2 strangers forced together by circumstance, and something more like 2 people who had just discovered, quite unexpectedly, that they might actually be capable of working toward the same goal. Word of Marsh's dismissal spread through the household staff and the tenant farms within days, and Eliza noticed, almost immediately, a subtle shift in how she was regarded. Mrs. Prout's cold contempt did not vanish overnight, but it softened, edged now with something like wary respect. Alice began to smile more freely in her presence. And when Eliza walked the grounds one crisp morning not long after, several tenant farmers who had barely acknowledged her before now stopped their work to nod respectfully, or even to offer a few careful words of thanks. She had not saved Ashworth Hall, not yet, but she had, for the first time since arriving in that shaking, rain-battered carriage, begun to believe that saving it might actually be possible. And far away, in a warm and comfortable drawing room in the city, Lord Pemberton and Lady Vane, who had arranged this marriage as an instrument of quiet destruction, remained entirely unaware that the weapon they had sent to Ashworth Hall had just begun turning, with quiet, patient, unstoppable determination, entirely against them. The dismissal of Godfrey Marsh solved one problem and revealed a dozen more, each smaller than theft but no less urgent, and Eliza spent the following weeks discovering exactly how deep the estate's troubles ran. The roof over the east wing leaked in 4 separate places. 2 of the tenant cottages needed new thatch before winter arrived in earnest. The estate's small flock of sheep had been allowed to dwindle through years of neglect, sold off gradually by Marsh whenever he needed to cover his tracks, until barely enough remained to be worth calling a flock at all. She approached these problems the way she approached everything, with lists, with careful questions, and with a refusal to be discouraged by the size of the task in front of her. She spoke with the farmers directly rather than through Marsh's replacement, a quiet, honest young man named Peter Holloway, whom Edward had promoted from among the estate's own workers rather than hiring another outside steward whose loyalty could not yet be tested. She asked the farmers what they needed most, and more importantly, she listened to their answers. What she heard again and again was a simple, practical request, not charity, not forgiveness of rent, though many of them were behind on payments through no real fault of their own. What they wanted was investment, better seed, proper tools, a chance to improve their yield so that both they and the estate might prosper together, rather than the estate simply extracting whatever it could and giving nothing back. Eliza thought of her father's shipping company, of the trade routes she had studied at his side, of the wool merchants she had negotiated with since the age of 16, and an idea began to take shape in her mind, one that went far beyond simply patching the estate's immediate wounds. She brought the idea to Edward one evening in his study, now noticeably warmer and more orderly than it had been on her first night at Ashworth Hall, since she had quietly encouraged him, without ever quite ordering him, to let some daylight and fresh air into the room along with the fresh flowers that had begun appearing there regularly. "The wool from these hills is excellent," she said, spreading a rough map of the estate's lands across his desk. "Better than what my father's company currently purchases from further south, if the samples the tenants showed me are representative. If we invested properly in the flock, and in proper shearing and cleaning practices, we could sell directly to merchants in the city rather than through middlemen who currently take the largest share of the profit." Edward studied the map, then looked up at her with an expression that had grown steadily less guarded over the preceding weeks. "You are proposing we become merchants ourselves." "I am proposing we stop bleeding money through inefficiency and start using what this land actually does well," Eliza said. "My father's company would happily purchase wool of the quality these hills could produce, at a fair price, if given the chance to see samples. I could write to him this very week." There was a pause, and for a moment Eliza worried she had pushed too far, too fast, asking a proud old family to accept help from trade connections they might consider beneath them. But Edward surprised her, as he had been surprising her more and more often in recent days. "My father would have hated this idea," he said slowly, "and my grandfather would have hated it even more, which, I confess, makes me inclined to like it rather better than I otherwise might." A ghost of something like a smile crossed his face, the first genuine one Eliza had seen from him since her arrival. "Write to your father, Eliza. Let us see what this land can truly do." It was the first time he had used her given name. Eliza wrote to her father that same night, describing the estate's lands, the quality of the wool, and the improvements she believed could be made with proper investment. And though she tried to keep her letter businesslike and practical, she could not entirely keep the hope out of her words. Her father's reply arrived within the fortnight, warmer and more enthusiastic than she had dared expect, along with a promise to send one of his most trusted buyers to examine the wool samples directly, and a note, tucked at the very end, that made her eyes sting unexpectedly with tears. "I always told you, my dear girl, that a mind for numbers and a good heart were worth more than any dowry a man could ask for. It seems your husband has finally begun to notice what I have known about you your entire life." With her father's buyer's visit arranged, and Peter Holloway working diligently alongside the tenant farmers to rebuild the flock and improve the land's practices, Eliza turned her attention next to the household itself. She could not, in good conscience, continue overseeing grand plans for wool and trade while the staff who kept the house running went underpaid, and the roof continued to leak over their heads. She reviewed the recovered funds from Marsh's theft carefully alongside the estate's legitimate income, prioritizing the most urgent repairs first. The roof was patched before the worst of the autumn rains arrived. Wages, adjusted to fair and honest levels for the first time in years, were paid promptly, and in full, a change that Mrs. Prout, of all people, seemed to appreciate more than anyone, her stiff formality softening by slow degrees into something almost approaching warmth whenever Eliza passed her in the hallways. Not everyone in the household welcomed these changes with equal grace, and Eliza was not naive enough to believe that recovering some stolen money and mending a few relationships had solved every problem facing Ashworth Hall. But for the first time since her arrival, walking the halls of that great, cold house no longer felt like walking through a tomb. There was activity now, purpose, the sound of hammers repairing broken shutters, and the smell of proper meals being prepared in a kitchen that finally had the funds to buy more than the barest necessities. It was during this period, as the estate slowly began to heal, that Eliza first heard whispers of concern reaching her from an unexpected direction. A letter arrived one afternoon from a distant cousin of Edward's, warning, in carefully polite language, that certain persons in the city had begun asking pointed questions about the new Lady Ashworth, about her background, her family's trade connections, and whether such connections were entirely appropriate for a woman now bearing an old and respected noble name. Eliza recognized, immediately, the source of this sudden curiosity. Lord Pemberton and Lady Vane, having watched their plan for quiet humiliation fail to produce the disgrace they had intended, were beginning to search for other ways to achieve the same end. If Ashworth Hall could not be destroyed by neglect and shame from within, perhaps it could still be damaged by scandal and rumor from without. She said nothing of this letter to Edward immediately, not wishing to alarm him before she understood the full shape of the threat, but she kept it carefully, and began, quietly, to prepare herself for whatever might come next. She had already proven, to herself if to no one else, that she was capable of surviving far worse than idle gossip among people who had never once bothered to learn her actual name before deciding to despise her. Let them come, she thought, standing at her window one clear evening and watching lantern light flicker in the newly repaired cottages across the estate, warm and steady against the darkening hills. Let them try whatever they intend to try. She had already turned their first weapon against them once. She would not hesitate to do so again. The letter from Edward's cousin proved to be only the first small tremor before a larger storm, and it arrived, fittingly enough, at the Harrington Autumn Assembly, an event held each year at the grandest house in the county, and attended by nearly everyone of standing within 50 miles. Edward had been reluctant to attend at all, having avoided such gatherings for years while the estate's troubles kept him occupied and ashamed. But Eliza had gently convinced him that hiding away any longer would only feed whatever rumors were already beginning to circulate. "If we do not appear," she reasoned, helping him straighten his coat before they departed, "they will assume we have something to hide. Let them see instead that we do not." The assembly hall, when they arrived, glittered with candlelight and the low murmur of dozens of conversations, and Eliza felt the weight of curious eyes upon her the moment she stepped through the doors on Edward's arm. She held her chin level and her expression pleasant, exactly as her father had taught her to do when walking into a room full of merchants who doubted a young woman could possibly understand the business she had come to discuss. Lady Vane found them within the first quarter hour, gliding across the polished floor with a smile so sweet it might have curdled sugar. "Lady Ashworth," she said, drawing the title out as though testing whether it truly fit. "How wonderful to finally meet you properly. We have all heard such interesting things." "Have you?" Eliza replied evenly. "I do hope they were at least entertaining, Lady Vane, since I understand very little of it was likely to be true." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the small circle of guests who had gathered to watch this exchange, and Lady Vane's smile tightened at the edges. "One does hear, my dear, that your family's fortune comes entirely from trade. Wool, was it? Or fish, perhaps? It is so difficult to keep track of these things." "Wool, silk, spices, and timber, among other goods," Eliza said pleasantly. "Carried across 3 seas by ships my father built himself from nothing but good judgment and harder work than most men in this room have ever known. I am rather proud of it, Lady Vane, and I confess I have never understood why anyone should feel shame at honest labor, however far it may be beneath the notice of those who have never had to perform any." The laughter this time was less quiet, and Lady Vane's composure cracked visibly enough that Lord Pemberton, watching from a few paces away with his usual thin, calculating expression, stepped forward smoothly to redirect the conversation before it could damage his companion standing any further. "Lady Ashworth has always had a sharp tongue, I am told," he said, his tone deceptively light. "One wonders whether such sharpness serves a household well, or whether it might, in time, prove rather more corrosive than charming." "I find, Lord Pemberton," Eliza said, meeting his gaze directly, "that a sharp mind has served the Ashworth estate rather better in recent months than years of polite silence ever managed to do. Perhaps you have heard that our tenant farms are recovering nicely this season. Perhaps you have also heard why they fell into such disrepair in the first place." Something flickered behind Pemberton's eyes, quick and wary, and Eliza felt Edward's arm tense slightly beneath her hand. She had not told him yet in full detail of her growing suspicion that these two, along with whoever else had arranged this marriage, might have had some connection to Marsh's years of theft, whether through direct involvement or simply through convenient blindness to a scheme that served their own purposes. She had no full proof of it yet. But she had learned, from years of watching her father deal with dishonest men, that guilt often revealed itself in exactly this kind of flicker, quick and involuntary, before a person's composure could catch up and smooth it over. "I am certain I have no idea what you mean," Pemberton said smoothly, recovering himself. "Of course not," Eliza said, matching his smoothness with her own. "I merely find it curious, my lord, how very interested certain persons in this county have suddenly become in Ashworth Hall's affairs, precisely at the moment those affairs have finally begun to improve rather than decline. One might almost think someone preferred the estate to remain exactly as broken as it was before." The silence that followed this remark lasted only a moment before Lady Vane, with a bright, brittle laugh, declared that the musicians were about to begin and swept away, pulling Lord Pemberton with her, leaving behind a small circle of guests who exchanged glances that suggested the evening's gossip had just acquired an entirely new and far more interesting subject. Later that night, in the carriage returning to Ashworth Hall, Edward finally asked the question Eliza had been expecting. "You believe Pemberton and Vane had something to do with Marsh's theft?" "I believe," Eliza said carefully, "that a man does not steal from an estate for 5 years without someone benefiting from his silence, or without someone finding it convenient that the estate remain weak. I have no proof yet, but I intend to find some." Edward was quiet for a long moment, watching the dark hills pass outside the carriage window. "When I agreed to this marriage," he said finally, "I believed I was simply accepting one more indignity in a long line of them. I did not expect to find, in the person sent to complete my family's ruin, the first ally I have had in years." Eliza felt something warm settle in her chest at those words, unexpected and unfamiliar after weeks of coldness and suspicion. "Then let us be allies in earnest, my lord," she said. "There is a great deal more work ahead of us, and I find I would rather face it beside someone who has finally decided to fight, than alone against people who never expected either of us to try." Edward reached across the carriage seat, and for the first time since her arrival at Ashworth Hall, took her hand in his, and neither of them said anything more for the remainder of the journey, though the silence between them now felt entirely different from the cold, guarded silence of that very first night. The proof Eliza sought did not arrive quickly, nor easily, but she had never expected it to. She began, patiently, to trace the threads connecting Godfrey Marsh to the wider world beyond Ashworth Hall, starting with the false names he had invented for his fictional repair contractors. Peter Holloway, now thoroughly trusted in his new role as steward, helped her dig through years of old correspondence and payment records, and slowly, a pattern began to emerge that confirmed her suspicions far more completely than she had dared hope. Several of the false payments Marsh had recorded matched, in timing and in amount, to periods when Lord Pemberton's own finances, according to careful inquiries Eliza's father made discreetly on her behalf through his network of trade contacts, had shown unexplained improvements despite Pemberton's estate producing notably less income of its own than it should have. It was not conclusive proof of direct collusion, not the kind that could be presented before a magistrate with full confidence of success, but it was more than enough to confirm what Eliza had already suspected in her bones. Marsh had not acted entirely alone. He had been protected, perhaps even encouraged, by someone who benefited from Ashworth Hall's continued weakness, someone with every reason to want the estate to remain exactly as broken and humiliated as it had been on the day Eliza first arrived in the rain. Rather than confront Pemberton directly, a move Eliza recognized would only allow him to prepare his defenses and cover his tracks more carefully. She decided instead on a different approach, one that would let the truth speak for itself in front of the very people whose opinion Pemberton and Vane had tried so hard to turn against her and Edward. The opportunity presented itself at the Yorkshire County Assembly some weeks later, a gathering even larger and more prestigious than the Harrington event, attended by magistrates, landowners, and merchants from across the entire region. Eliza spent the days beforehand preparing carefully, organizing the evidence she and Peter had gathered into a clear, simple presentation that any reasonable person could follow, exactly as her father had once taught her to present a case to skeptical investors, who needed facts laid before them plainly rather than buried in complicated language, designed to confuse rather than clarify. She did not plan a dramatic public accusation, understanding that such theater might easily backfire and paint her as vindictive rather than justified. Instead, she arranged, through a mutual acquaintance who owed her father a great debt of gratitude for past business dealings, to have the region's most respected magistrate present at a smaller gathering held the evening before the main assembly, ostensibly a simple dinner among acquaintances, but in truth a carefully orchestrated setting in which the truth about Marsh's theft, and the strong evidence suggesting Pemberton's involvement, could be laid out clearly and calmly before witnesses whose word carried genuine weight in the county. Lord Pemberton, invited to the dinner along with several other guests without any indication of what awaited him, arrived in good spirits, clearly unaware of what the evening actually held. Eliza watched his composure crack, slowly and then all at once, as Peter Holloway calmly walked the assembled guests through the evidence, the false names, the matching payment dates, the unexplained improvements in Pemberton's own finances that coincided so precisely with Ashworth Hall's years of unexplained losses. "This is outrageous," Pemberton said finally, his careful composure entirely abandoned. "A collection of coincidences, nothing more. You cannot possibly prove any direct connection." "You are quite right, my lord," Eliza said calmly, "that we cannot prove, beyond all possible doubt, exactly what arrangement existed between yourself and Mr. Marsh. But I wonder whether the magistrate here present, and the other guests who have heard this evidence tonight, will find the timing and pattern of these coincidences quite as innocent as you suggest. I wonder, too, whether your standing in this county will survive the retelling of tonight's evidence, regardless of what any court might ultimately decide." The magistrate, a stern and careful man well known for his fairness, spoke then, his voice grave. "I cannot bring formal charges on evidence this circumstantial, Lord Pemberton, but I will say plainly that what I have heard tonight troubles me a great deal, and I suspect it will trouble others equally once word of it spreads, as such things inevitably do. It was, Eliza knew, exactly the outcome she had hoped for. Not a formal conviction, which the evidence could not yet support, but something perhaps even more effective within the world Pemberton and Vane had built their entire lives around. A world governed as much by reputation and whispered opinion as by any court of law. By the time the county assembly began the following evening, word of the previous night's revelations had already spread through every drawing room and dinner table for miles, and Eliza watched with quiet satisfaction as Lord Pemberton and Lady Vane found themselves, for the first time, on the receiving end of exactly the kind of cold, judging stares they had once directed so freely at her. Edward, standing beside her as the evening's dancing began, leaned close and murmured, "I do not believe I have ever seen anyone so thoroughly and so quietly destroyed without a single blow being struck." "I did not destroy them, my lord," Eliza said, watching Lady Vane retreat toward the far end of the hall, her earlier brightness entirely extinguished. "I merely showed everyone the truth of what they had already done to themselves. That is all I have ever done since arriving at Ashworth Hall. Shown the truth and let it speak." With Marsh's theft exposed and Pemberton's reputation quietly but thoroughly damaged, the immediate threats to Ashworth Hall's recovery began to fade. But the work of rebuilding was far from finished, and Eliza found, over the months that followed, that she had grown to love this work more deeply than she had ever expected to love anything beyond her father's shipping company. The wool trade with her father's business flourished beyond even her early hopes. The samples sent that first autumn had impressed the buyers so thoroughly that a standing agreement was soon established, guaranteeing Ashworth Hall's wool a steady and generous market for years to come. Peter Holloway proved himself not merely honest but genuinely skilled, expanding the flock carefully and introducing improved farming methods that increased yields across every tenant farm on the estate. Cottages that had stood half-ruined were repaired. Children who had gone without proper schooling began attending a small school Eliza helped establish in the village, funded partly by the estate and partly by her own personal correspondence with charitable contacts her father had cultivated over decades of trade. Edward, too, changed during this period, slowly shedding the exhausted resignation that had defined him on their first meeting and growing instead into a man who took genuine pride in his estate's recovery, who rode out among the tenant farms himself to see the improvements firsthand, who began, for the first time in years, to laugh freely and often, particularly in Eliza's company. What had begun as a marriage of convenience, arranged by cruel men for cruel purposes, had grown, through months of shared purpose and hard-won trust, into something neither of them had expected nor dared to hope for. A genuine partnership, built on mutual respect, and though neither of them spoke the word aloud for some time yet, something very much resembling love. It was nearly 2 years after that first rain-soaked arrival that Eliza proposed the idea that would ultimately transform Ashworth Hall from a recovering estate into something far greater than either she or Edward had initially imagined possible. "The wool trade has proven what this land can do when properly managed," she said one evening, spreading fresh papers across Edward's desk, papers now covered not in desperate calculations of debt, but in careful projections of growth. "But wool alone will only take us so far. I have been corresponding with my father about the textile mills being built along the northern rivers. If we invested in a small mill of our own, processing the wool ourselves rather than selling it raw, we could capture profits currently going entirely to others." Edward studied the figures she had prepared, his expression thoughtful rather than doubtful, a transformation Eliza still found quietly remarkable every time she witnessed it. "You are proposing we build something entirely new, not merely restore what was, but create something that has never existed here before." "I am proposing," Eliza said, "that Ashworth Hall stop merely surviving and start truly thriving. We have proven together that this land and these people are capable of far more than anyone ever expected of them, including, I suspect, ourselves. Why should we stop at simple recovery when genuine prosperity is within our reach. Edward was quiet for a long moment, and then slowly he smiled, the same warm, genuine smile that had become so familiar to her over the preceding months. "Then let us build it," he said. "Together, exactly as we have built everything else since that first terrible evening you arrived in the rain." The mill was built over the following year, funded partly by the estate's own recovering finances and partly by a partnership arrangement with Eliza's father's company, an arrangement that benefited both families handsomely and cemented a bond of trust between trade and title that many in the county had once considered impossible. Local workers, many of them the very tenant farmers whose lives Eliza had helped improve years before, found steady employment within its walls, processing wool that had once left the estate raw and undervalued into fine finished cloth that commanded prices far beyond anything the raw material alone could have achieved. Word of Ashworth Hall's remarkable recovery spread throughout the county and beyond, carried by merchants who had done business with the estate and by guests who had witnessed, firsthand, the transformation of a house once considered beyond saving into one of the most productive and well-managed estates in the entire region. The very people who had once whispered about the merchant's daughter, sent to humiliate a dying noble family, now spoke of Lady Ashworth with an entirely different tone, one of genuine respect, and in many cases, something approaching awe. Lord Pemberton and Lady Vane, their own influence considerably diminished by the events of that fateful county assembly years before, found themselves increasingly excluded from the social circles they had once dominated, their names mentioned now more often in connection with old scandal than current standing. Eliza took no particular pleasure in their decline, having long since redirected her energy toward building rather than dwelling on old grievances. But she would be lying to herself if she claimed she felt no satisfaction at all in watching justice, however slow and quiet, ultimately find its way to those who had tried so hard to cause harm to people who had never wronged them. 5 years after that first rain-soaked arrival at Ashworth Hall's neglected gates, Eliza stood once again in the estate's grand entrance hall, though the room itself bore almost no resemblance to the dusty, cracked, and shadowed space she had first walked through as a frightened and determined young bride. Sunlight now streamed freely through windows kept properly clean and clear. The chandelier overhead blazed with light every evening, a small but meaningful luxury the estate could now easily afford. Fresh flowers, grown in gardens Eliza herself had helped restore to their former glory, filled the hall with color and life. The mill, now employing nearly 200 workers from the surrounding villages, had grown into one of the most respected textile operations in the north of England, its finished cloth sought after by merchants and tailors as far away as London itself. The tenant farms, once barely surviving, now produced yields that supported not only the estate's own needs, but a healthy surplus that funded schools, a proper hospital for the village, and improvements that benefited every family living upon Ashworth land. Peter Holloway, still faithfully serving as steward, had married Alice some years before, the two of them having grown close during those early difficult years of rebuilding, and their own children now ran laughing through halls that had once known only silence and neglect. Edward, standing beside Eliza in that transformed entrance hall as they prepared to welcome guests to a celebration marking the estate's 5th anniversary of recovery, took her hand in his, exactly as he had done that night in the carriage so many years before. "Do you remember," he said quietly, watching the first carriages begin arriving along the newly repaired drive, "what Pemberton and Vane intended when they sent you here?" "I remember," Eliza said, "every single detail of it. I have never forgotten, and I do not intend to. They sent you here believing you would be the instrument of this estate's final destruction," Edward said, "a weapon aimed at everything my family had built, however poorly we ourselves had managed to preserve it by that point. And instead," Eliza said, smiling as she watched the ground she had helped restore glowing warm and golden in the late afternoon light, "I became something else entirely." "You became," Edward said softly, the greatest thing that has ever happened to this family and to this land and to me most of all. That evening's celebration drew guests from across the entire county and beyond, landowners and merchants alike, many of whom had once dismissed Eliza as an unwelcome intrusion upon noble society, and now sought her counsel and friendship with genuine warmth and respect. Her father attended as well, older now but still sharp-eyed and proud, watching his daughter move through the grand hall with the same easy confidence and quiet authority she had first shown him as a girl of 12 balancing ledgers late into the night. And it was clear to everyone present, in every glance and every gesture, that this remarkable transformation had been built not through luck or inheritance, but through the patient, determined work of a woman who had refused to be the weapon others intended her to become. In the years that followed, Ashworth Hall's name became synonymous throughout England, not merely with recovery from near ruin, but with genuine, thriving excellence, its wool and cloth renowned for quality, its schools and hospital admired as models for other estates to follow, its partnership between land and trade cited as proof that old prejudices between noble birth and honest commerce need not remain barriers forever. Lord and Lady Ashworth became known and respected not merely for their wealth, considerable as it had become, but for the fairness and genuine care with which they treated everyone whose lives touched their own, from the humblest tenant farmer to the grandest visiting dignitary. And though the story of how it had all begun, with a marriage arranged in spite and cruelty by men who had hoped to destroy rather than build, was never entirely forgotten, it was remembered in time, not as a tale of humiliation successfully achieved, but as proof of exactly the opposite. That an unwanted bride, sent with the intention of tearing an old and proud family down to nothing, had instead built, through patience, honesty, and an unshakable refusal to be underestimated, one of the greatest and most respected estates in the whole of England, a legacy that would endure for generations long after the names of those who had once tried to destroy her had faded entirely from memory. Ashworth Hall stood, in the end, as living proof of a simple truth that Eliza had carried with her since childhood, learned at her father's side over ledgers and trade routes, and the honest, patient work of building something real. That true strength was never measured by the circumstances a person was born into, or the cruelty others attempted to inflict upon them, but by what that person chose to build with their own two hands when everyone around them expected only ruin. Sent as a weapon meant to destroy, Eliza Colborne had instead become the architect of an empire, and Ashworth Hall, once counted among the dying estates of England, would forever after be remembered as one of its greatest.